Thanks, Matt Bender from the Department of General Services. I'm here at the committee's request to explain some issues related to the state contracting process, including our role at DGS, and also criteria for contracts that are awarded without competition. Because of the variety of contracts and the variety of rules that apply to them, today I'll be focusing on one category of contracts, which we call non-IT services. Contracts for outside legal counsel are one example of a non-IT services contract, and this non-IT services category includes basically all contracts for services except information technology services. And for simplicity's sake, I'll also skip some special rules governing architecture and engineering contracts. However, I am happy to answer the committee's questions about other categories of contracts. At the start, I want to note that DGS does not have a role in approving contracts between two or more private entities. Many of the contracts discussed in the briefing paper are contracts between regulated utilities and third parties, and basically the PUC's decisions as a regulatory body are not subject to DGS review or approval. My presentation will cover first kind of the basic statutory framework for state contracting, second, DGS contract review requirements, which contracts have to go to DGS, third, how we actually review the contracts, fourth, some special rules for contracts that governing for contracts for legal services, and finally some criteria that apply to contracts without competitive bidding and DGS's role with respect to those contracts. As I mentioned, there are different rules and processes for different types of contracts. A basic taxonomy or categorization of contracts for state contracting purposes would have them in four major categories: information technology, non-information technology goods, non-information technology services, and construction. Information technology goods and services are treated as their own separate category, and there's one set of rules for both IT goods and IT services. The non-IT services category encompasses basically all of the contracts for services, management consultants, medical services, pest control, you name it. In this presentation, I'll try to avoid saying non-IT services every time, but please bear in mind that I'm focusing on the requirements for non-IT services and not attempting to be comprehensive on all state contracts. DGS's role in these types of contracts is generally one of quality assurance. We're ensuring that the contract has been properly designed and properly awarded. This is distinct from our role for other types of contracts. For example, for non-IT goods and for most IT goods and services, the DGS Procurement Division acts as the central purchasing agency and actually awards the largest contracts itself. In non-IT services, the system is different. Each agency is responsible for conducting its own competitive bidding processes, determining its own contracting needs, and then presenting the contract to DGS for approval. The general rule is that a state contract for non-IT services is not effective unless and until approved by DGS. However, most contracts under $50,000 have been exempted from DGS approval, although these contracts do still need to follow state laws and policies. Also, some agencies, although not the PUC, have exemptions from DGS approval that go up to $150,000. Some contracts have to come to DGS for approval regardless of dollar value. These include contracts for certain hazardous activities and contracts that contain certain types of contract terms that warrant special legal review, like limiting the vendor's liability. In addition, most contract amendments have to come to DGS for review. Generally, if the original contract needed DGS approval, so does the amendment. There's a very limited exemption for amendments, just allowing additional time to complete performance without authorizing any additional costs or tasks. In some cases, even if the original contract didn't have to come to DGS, the amendment might. For example, if the amendment increases the contract value to more than $50,000, then DGS approval is required. So in the examples where the PUC initially awarded a legal services contract in the amount of $49,000 and then amended it to increase the dollar value, the original contract did not require DGS approval, but the amendment did. In addition, some services can be acquired using master service agreements or California multiple award schedule agreements that are created by the DGS procurement division. Because the terms for these contracts are developed by DGS, state agencies can use these agreements to create their own contracts without having to send them to DGS for legal review. Finally, there are numerous exemptions from DGS legal review that are created by statute. Generally, these exemptions are for specific agencies, often for specific types of contract for those agencies. The only one I'm aware of that's on point for the PUC is that Section 632 of the Public Utilities Code provides that PUC contracts for consulting or advisory services can be exempted from DGS review if the Commission makes a finding that extraordinary circumstances justify expedited contracting. We don't know whether or to what extent the PUC has used this exemption. It doesn't necessarily exempt them from other requirements that apply to contracts. So when our staff attorneys get a contract review, the review is structured around 4 key questions. First, does the contract comply with the law? Second, does it make business sense? Third, does it use clear and concise language? And fourth, have all other legal requirements been taken care of? And you can see that a lot of these questions are really questions that are legal in nature and that leverage the technical expertise of our staff attorneys in contracts. All of these questions apply both to amendments and to original contracts, and I'll briefly unpack each one. First, does the contract or amendment comply with the law? First question is, was it awarded using a lawful method? If competitive bidding was required, was the competitive bidding process followed? If it wasn't used, is there a valid exemption? If the contract is for personal services, and nearly all services contracts are, does the agency have a specific legal basis and adequate justification for contracting out for those services? This flows from the Civil Service Guarantee in Article 7 of the Constitution. Courts have interpreted that to limit state agencies' ability to contract for services that state employees could competently and effectively perform. Courts have recognized exemptions under which it is permissible to contract for services, and these exemptions are codified in Section 19130 of the Government Code. Agencies are generally required to include specific and detailed information that demonstrates how the contract meets one of the exemptions identified in Government Code 19130. Employee organizations have the right to bring challenges to contracts before the State Personnel Board, which then determines whether the contract is permissible under 19130 and the implied civil service mandate. Another big question, were all legal requirements for this specific type of contract met? And there are a variety of legal requirements that apply to some contracts, not others. Does the agency have sufficient budget authority to pay for the services? One thing that we require is that an agency accounting officer sign off that there are adequate funds to pay for the services. And if it's an amendment, is there authority to amend the contract? The second big question is, does the contract or amendment make business sense? Is it well drafted to obtain the desired results? Is the scope of work specific and realistic? Are the deliverables clear, measurable, and concise? Is the timetable realistic? Is the cost reasonable? And how did the agency determine that the cost was reasonable? Third big question is, does the contract requirement or amendment use clear and concise language? If it was awarded through competitive bidding, is it consistent with the solicitation of the bid? Is the contract term clearly stated? Is the scope of work clear regarding requirements? Are the payment terms clear? And finally, all other requirements, and I'll just skip those, but there can be requirements for other agencies' approvals as well. There are special rules that apply to contracts for legal services. First, and this is important, contracts for legal services are not subject to competitive bidding. Thus, amending a contract to increase its dollar value, even by a lot, doesn't present the same competitive bidding issues for a legal services contract as it does for other types of contracts. Although most state agencies are required to use the Attorney General for legal representation and to get the Attorney General's permission to use outside counsel, the PUC is exempt from those requirements by statute. There are specific requirements for state agencies to notify the union that represents state attorneys at various points in the process. These notices must be made within specified timeframes. There are specific detailed requirements for what must be included, and these notice requirements apply to amendments, not just to the original contract. Finally, criteria for contracts awarded without competitive bidding. In general, contracts valued at $5,000 or more must be awarded through competitive means. However, there are specific situations in which it's permissible to award a contract without competitive bidding. And for explanation purposes, we can group these exemptions into three major categories. First is exemptions created by statute. Second, exemptions established through administrative policy and published in the state contracting manual. And third, exemptions for specific contracts or specific groups of contracts that have been approved by DGS at the request of the contracting agency. We call these non-competitively bid contract requests, or NCBs. Requests that cover a group of contracts are called special category requests. First are the statutory exemptions. Some of these are general exemptions that apply across the board to a subcategory of contracts or to specific situations. In addition to legal services, these include expert witnesses, contracts with other public entities, emergency contracts in cases where a service is needed for the immediate preservation of the public health, welfare, or safety, or for the protection of state property. There's a streamlined process for contracting with small businesses and disabled veteran business enterprises for contracts up to $250,000 for goods, services, and IT. Two quotes are still required, but certain other competitive bidding requirements are waived. There are also numerous specific statutory exemptions from competitive bidding. Generally, these exemptions are for specific agencies, often for specific activities or specific types of contracts by those agencies. In some cases, the same contracts are also exempted from DGS review. Sometimes they're exempted from the entire public contract code. There are a variety of exemptions created by administrative policy and published in the state contracting manual. There are a limited number of cases where experience has shown that attempting to competitively bid a contract is either impractical or counterproductive. Just quickly running through the examples, certain smaller maintenance agreements, certain contracts where there's an exclusive service provider like the exclusive franchisee for waste hauling in a city, public entertainment contracts for fairs and expositions, conference and meeting facilities not to exceed $250,000, and certain contracts for emergency medical services, proprietary subscriptions, so on and so forth. Finally, DGS can exempt specific contracts or groups of contracts from competitive bidding based on a showing that the acquisition cannot be competitively bid and that the price is fair and reasonable. By a standing state policy, open and competitive bidding is to be utilized to the greatest extent possible. So we discourage this, but there are circumstances where it is warranted. A non-competitively bid contract request, or NCB, must be submitted and approved before the contract itself can be approved. The level of review depends on the size of the NCB. All of them are reviewed by the DGS Procurement Division. Over $250,000, they're reviewed by our attorneys. Over $750,000, they're reviewed by the State Chief Procurement Officer. Over $5 million, they're reviewed by the Director of General Services. And those are the highest, and those people need to sign off before it's allowed. For these purposes, amendments are treated as having a dollar value of the cumulative value of the contract, including the amendment. which is more conservative than just looking at the amendment. If the NCB is submitted because there wasn't enough time to conduct a competitive bid, we require the agency to submit a corrective action plan for how they're going to avoid those situations in the future. Special category requests are similar to NCBs but cover a category of contract and are good for up to 3 years. The same criteria basically apply to those. And we get less than 300 NCB requests per year. Sizable majority of them are approved, and this is, we hope, because we've spent a lot of time over the last decade educating state agencies about our expectations for NCB contracts, what we're willing to approve, what we're not willing to approve, so that in general we're able to get NCBs where agencies understand the criteria and are able, maybe with some back and forth or further research, to justify their need. With that, I'll conclude my testimony, and thank you.
Thank you.